I don't want you to freak out about it. Okay, at this point, it's about reading these kind of old, hard to read documents, pulling out the pertinent information to the best of your ability. Answers, complete sentences, but I just want you to explain what you think, even if you're off a little bit. Okay, that's not necessarily going to stand against you because at this point, it's all about exposure, exposing you to documents that frankly, these ones are like 400 years old, or no, 1400 years old. People talk a little bit different. Okay, you need to get used to that. In these ones, most of the names are in Arabic. That can be kind of confusing. You need to learn to scan through the stuff you don't understand and try to pick out the good information from what you can. Because I'm telling you, in this class, our tests, quizzes, a lot of our writing assignments, document analysis is a piece of the puzzle. So get it in. Don't freak out if you don't fully understand, what the answer should be. I'm just looking to see that you're thinking about it and following the instructions. So does that make sense? Okay, hopefully that helps a little bit on the stress level. Nobody emailed me or anything said, "Oh my God," but still, I know sometimes that stuff can be kind of challenging. It's all about experience. So that is due tonight by midnight. As far as anything else, any other work that actually is on this 6 weeks, because those 2 grades I'm shifting the next 6 weeks, I will still accept stuff up until 11:59 tonight. After that, everything is locking and we're pretty much done. So if you owe me anything, please get that stuff to me. Again, most of you guys are in pretty good shape, but some of you guys who are missing stuff could certainly be in better shape. So please get me that stuff as soon as you can, especially if it's like a notebook or something like that, because that's something that can drag your grade down quite a bit. So give me just a second to input my roll, and then we will get this show on the road. Get your notebooks out, and yeah, we'll be in some good shape. Like 5 more seconds. Okay. All right, let's get this show on the road. So we're picking up right where we left off. We had talked about kind of the early days of Islam, and Muhammad at this point has died, and there were some sort of problems, figuring out who was going to be the successor to Muhammad, because remember, Muhammad, not just a religious leader, almost from the get-go. He's a political leader because he's got a country to run. He is a military leader because, he's trying to fulfill that mission that was given to him, to spread the Islamic faith and specifically convert the polytheistic people of the Middle East. Guys, Islam grows really, really quick by trade, by travel, but also by military conquest. In the time of Muhammad, conquers, takes over, governs, spreads the faith of Islam over most of the Arabian Peninsula. Then, after he dies, and you've got a succession of caliphs. What's a caliph? Do you guys remember what that means? What's a caliph? What is it?
Leader of the Islamic faith.
Very good. He's the leader of the Islamic faith, also the leader of these new Islamic empires. And what's that called? A caliphate. Fantastic. Almost as if I was pointing. Yeah, these first few caliphs of our early caliphates. Here it says the patriarchal caliphate. Oftentimes you'll hear it referred to as the Rashidun caliphate. They acquire more and more territory, thus, kind of ensuring that Muhammad's dreams are reality. And then, because it's very contentious, who's going to take over? There's assassinations. Things are messed up. A family takes over, a family of merchants who essentially buy off the military, and they will run and expand the Islamic world for many years afterwards, the Umayyad Caliphate. And by the time we get to about 750, this is what the Islamic world, aka Dar al-Islam, it's pretty much what it looks like. You've got the Arabian Peninsula east, you've got the entirety of North Africa, You have the Iberian Peninsula, which today is mainly Spain and Portugal. You've got kind of a little bit into Turkey, and you've got lots of Central Asia, the former kind of Persian territory, really going all the way to what is today India. And again, you look at the distribution of religions this day. Guys, none of this happened by accident. It's not like people in Australia one day woke up and said, you know what, we're all going to be Christians. There's history here. You want to know why people speak the languages they speak, why they worship the gods that they worship, why they behave the way that they do. You look at history. You look at who traded where. You look at the groups that interacted. You look at who conquered who. You look at who colonized who. And very much, you know, the areas in those early days that Islam really spread and flourished, well, it more or less continues to this day. And hey, what do you know? Caliphate. And we went through this already. I just thought that I would kind of review. So like I said, the early first four caliphs, they're killed off, they die, they're done. The Umayyad take over. The Umayyad are around for about 90 years. They do help to establish and broaden the territory. But the big thing I want you to remember about them is they're the ones that retain power. Even after the Abbasids take over, they're the ones that retain power for a time on the Iberian Peninsula. And then eventually they're kind of replaced by other Muslim groups like the Moors. And then eventually they're pushed out by the Roman Catholics years and years and years later. But their rule is the primary reason. You go to Spain to this day, you're going to see a lot of Islamic architecture. And again, remember in Islamic architecture and artwork, you're not going to see a whole lot of humans or living beings, but they're really big on calligraphy. They're very big on geometric designs. Man, some of the mosques around the world are some of the more beautiful structures. These are the guys, though, today. These are the ones prior to 1200 that really are the heart and soul of Islam. They're the ones that have interactions with most other civilizations that we will discuss, both good and bad. They're the ones that are really known for innovation. Okay, very similar to the Tang and Song dynasties in the East, you could ascribe almost the exact same characteristics to the Abbasid Caliphate here in the West. They're big into intellectual innovation and technology. They're huge proponents of sponsoring trade. Being a merchant in the Abbasid Caliphate was very prestigious. Because remember, Muhammad himself was a merchant. They really were known for facilitating that trade, like I said. And aside from that, given their geographic location here in the Middle East, at the crossroads of Europe and Africa and Asia, even the stuff they don't come up with on their own, this is a point of diffusion for all sorts of ideas and technology and beliefs from this point going into Africa and Europe as well. Decent amount on the Abbasids. Now remember, when we do notes, your notes are your notes. You don't have to write every single thing I say is important, but you know, getting some of it would be advisable. Remember, you can put stuff in your own words, that's perfectly fine, but these are some of the key things that you need to know about the Abbasids: trade and technology. The new rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate, they build a new capital city, which is still around today, but they really are the ones that built it up. And in their time, it was really a thriving, cosmopolitan, advanced city. The capital of the Abbasid Empire was Baghdad. It served, I'll kind of show you where it's at. It was just a natural crossroads of trade. You know, you've got Indian Ocean trade funneling up through the Persian Gulf, not too far from Baghdad, but really overland trade, you know, coming from the east to the west. I mean, this area is a perfect spot for diffusion. Baghdad becomes one of the wealthiest and largest trade cities in the world during the time period of the Abbasids. Situated in an ideal spot for trans-Eurasian trade, the Abbasids helped revitalize Silk Road trade, greatly expanded trans-Saharan trade, North African trade, which we will get into more next week, and were major players in the diffusion of goods and ideas throughout the Indian Ocean. They come up with a bunch of stuff on their own, as you're about to see. But they also were the caretakers of all this knowledge, all these ideas coming in from the East, and even some of the stuff that had been lost in the West after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476. Again, a lot of that old Roman and really Greek philosophy and knowledge, they held on to it. They translated, they built off it. If it wasn't for people like the Abbasids, some of those old works of people like Aristotle and Plato may have been lost forever. So again, they were the caretakers of all this knowledge, all these ideas, and it's from there that they will launch further into the West, especially as Europe kind of starts to creep out of the Dark Ages. Baghdad soon rivaled Constantinople in both wealth and population, and the Abbasid Caliphate became one of the most powerful and innovative empires of its time. Do you guys remember what empire Constantinople was the capital of? I'll give you a hint. It was named after Constantine, who's pretty important in world history. He was the first Roman emperor to advocate a certain belief system, helped put together the fundamental organized church of this belief system. You should know, guys. It's the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine. Remember, Constantine was the first Christian Roman emperor and really did a lot to help sponsor the faith in its relatively early days. One of the big things to know about Baghdad, other than just being this giant trade hub, it's a center of learning. Okay, much like in the East, the Chinese are really advocating for education and broadening their knowledge. Guys, the Abbasids are doing the same thing at the same time in the West. In fact, borrowing paper-making techniques from China, at that time the Tang Dynasty, the process was improved in Baghdad, making the paper thicker and better for bookmaking. Baghdad had a lot of books, which I know you're like, who cares, books, but it's a really big deal. A cataloger of books in the 10th century listed thousands of existing titles and authors, many from lands far from the caliph's court. During this time period, books were a huge luxury. Now think about it. The 10th century is the 900s. Why 1100 years ago would a book be something really, really fancy? Okay.
Because it was paper, made off paper.
Well, you're not wrong. I mean, paper, not everybody knows how to make that stuff. The Chinese do at this point, the Abbasids do, that's about it. So that's one reason. I mean,
The, like, writing, like, I don't know if they, like, can print it, the handwriting.
at this point, yeah. Books, by and large, are handwritten. Block printing really becomes more of a thing a little bit later in the Song Dynasty. So really up to this point, and even if they had block printing, it hadn't really traveled to the West yet. At this point, if you've got a book, it was written by hand. It was bound and stitched by hand. How long do you think it would take? Like if we got our textbook out, which is, I don't know, maybe 300 pages. How long do you think it would take you to copy that word for word by hand? Like how many days, 8-hour days, do you think that would take? A lot. It might take you a month. Okay, if you're being paid by the hour, how much money do you think that would cost? Again, there's all these things that we take for granted. But back, in these days, this is 1,000 years ago about, everything was more difficult. So if you were someone or you were a group that had thousands of books, that tells you a couple different things. A, you got yourself a lot of money. And B, you're willing to spend a lot of money to broaden your mind, okay? Islam, especially during these days, that idea of educating yourself and really advancing intellectually and knowing as much as you possibly could, much like you see that in Confucianism in China, it was very, very big, a big important part of how the Abbasid kind of lived their lives. The expansion of the intellectual world of Baghdad represented the beginning of, this should sound familiar, a golden age of Islam. golden age of Islam. Now, we talked about this with the Tang and the Song dynasty. Again, same time period. They're trade partners, there's connections. What's the golden age like again? I mean, how would you describe a golden age?
A lot of money and gold.
Yeah, I mean, literally gold. But it's not just that, okay? The economy is strong. The state, the country is thriving. The people are generally pretty happy and prosperous. And they're making advancements. They're doing things that other people aren't, comparatively. So it's an age of great technological advancements and intellectual advancements. It's an age of prosperity. You know, we've kind of mentioned a few golden ages, but you got two that are essentially going on at the same time. In the East, the Tang, later the Song, the golden age of Chinese history at that point. And here, the golden age of Islam. It's not an accident. I mean, those two groups did trade with each other. Stuff that was going from the East was diffusing to the West, you know, via those connections, and vice versa. This is definitely important to write down. The House of Wisdom. If you don't have it down, please write it down. It gets referenced a lot, even though it was established a little bit before our time period that we started in 1200. It will still be around in 1200, at least for a while. The House of Wisdom. Guys, under the Abbasids, and to a lesser degree, other caliphates that will follow, guys, there was this huge emphasis on learning. I mean, they're sinking a lot of money into it. They're bringing in scholars from all over the world because, again, that's part of the ideology. They want to know as much as they can. And the House of Wisdom in their capital city of Baghdad was famous throughout the known world. Famous for a place where, you know, scholars and poets and philosophers and scientists of the age, you know, could come together and share their ideas, regardless of if they're a Muslim or Christian or whoever, because again, it was just all about knowledge, acquiring knowledge. It was about acquiring wisdom. Probably the biggest thing that comes out of here, the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, I'll probably mispronounce a lot of words today, established the basis of algebra. Which I hate math, always have. It's kind of sad. I'm not a math guy, I'm a history guy. But, you know, algebra, I mean, having that basic knowledge, I mean, it can broaden a lot of possibilities for you. They were one of the first groups to build really formal universities. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin from Fez, Morocco, 859 CE, Morocco is in North Africa, was the first university in the world to offer degrees. The Library of Al-Hakam II, Cordoba, Spain. This would have been under the Umayyad, but still. Library contains several 100,000 books. And keep in mind, this is a time period where most of Europe is just messed up. It's kind of at the tail end of the Dark Ages, but still outside of Spain, you know, most of Western Europe, I mean, they're really struggling. They're behind a lot of the rest of the world. Yet in this area, hundreds of thousands of books. It tells you a lot about their values. Al-Azhar University, Cairo, Egypt. The university offered undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. So undergraduate, you're thinking like your associates, your bachelor's. Postgraduate, you're thinking like your master's degree, your PhD, your doctorate. Al-Nizamiya University, Baghdad, 1065. Offered free education. Again, that's a lot of money. A lot of money to build these things. A lot of money to acquire all these books. It tells you something about their values. Some illustrations. Like I said, the House of Wisdom in particular is very famous in history for being, you know, almost one of a kind, at least for the time period. Scholars come around, they would have debates, they would have lectures, they would share, you know, books and scrolls all filled with information. This picture down here in the right-hand corner, that's actually from that time period. It's an illustration, I think, that was completed there. And here you see, you know, a group of scholars sitting around, listening to some guy speak, giving essentially a lecture. Again, this is 1,000 years ago. That's pretty astonishing when you really think about it. And I mean, all the ideas that were collected there and elsewhere, you know, I mean, they kind of serve as the diffusion point for a lot of those ideas to spread further to the West, further to the East too, for that matter. Okay, now I know this is a lot, and I don't want you to write down every single thing because that'll just be overwhelming. But you need to know some specific innovations, some specific achievements that come out of Islam's golden age. So write a few of these down. Some of them I'll kind of skip over, like, you know, just calligraphy and stuff. But just you know, jot some down. Maybe one or two from each one of these categories. So math, science, philosophy. The Islamic world borrowed the concept of zero from India during this time period because of trade relations and travel. And with that, in math, they spread the use of Arabic numerals. Does anybody know what an Arabic numeral is? This is crazy stuff. It's the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Guys, before you really start to see this understanding of numbers really diffuse through the Middle East to elsewhere, guys, people weren't counting like that. They weren't recording information like that. Here's the weird thing. They're called Arabic numerals because people in Europe learned about them from the Arabs. Well, the Arabs learned about it from India with their interactions with the Indians. Yet because they helped to spread that information, this number system to this day is still called Arabic numerals. A lot of math, advances in algebra, geometry, science, you got astronomy, geography, in the Persian-held territories, which were a part of the Abbasid Caliphate. They did a lot of geography, a lot of map making. They translated a lot of Greek literature and philosophy to Arabic. And that's really important because in Western Europe, after the fall of Rome in 476, a lot of that stuff has been destroyed or forgotten about. It's really the Arab Muslim world under the Abbasids that retained that information and allowed it to survive to this day. Art and architecture, palaces, mosques, calligraphy, stuff like that. You do need to remember that Islamic art, you're not going to see a whole lot of living beings or any really usually, just because, of that focus to really get away from idol worship. But there is one really, there's more than this, but this is the one I think you guys would know. Famous works of literature, this is the time period that Arabian Nights was written. Anybody ever seen Aladdin? All right. Aladdin technically probably lived under the Abbasid Caliphate, but he was a little bit further to the east. He was in the former Persian-held territory. But guys, that story is set in this time period. In the field of medicine, they wrote the most complete medical encyclopedia that had ever been produced at the time. Again, they're thinking about things. They were the ones that discovered blood moves to and from the heart. They diagnosed and treated diseases such as measles and smallpox, which will still be a big deal afterwards. But, they were the first to really, spend a lot of time trying to treat those sometimes fatal illnesses. Doctors and pharmacists, this blows my mind. And again, this is 1,000 years ago. Doctors and pharmacists took licensure exams in order to practice. That's not how most of history is, But these people were like licensed doctors, licensed pharmacists, actually using science and observation to try to prescribe the correct medications. Again, real basic stuff, at least to us. But back then, maybe not so basic, because they were some of the only people in the world doing it. They borrowed a lot, especially from the Tang and the Song dynasties. We already talked about they borrowed paper making. They also borrowed gunpowder. Probably the first people in the West to really use it. Now, eventually, these things will diffuse into Africa and Europe. But that's what I mean. They were known for doing a lot of their own things. But they also held on to the ideas of other civilizations. And then other groups learned about those ideas from them. It was during this time period you also have an Islamic agricultural revolution, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is. The diffusion of cotton, sugar, citrus, fruits, rice throughout Dar al-Islam. If you remember back in our very first lecture, that really long one that probably some of you slept in, if we go back tens and tens of thousands of years ago, you look at the placement of these major plants and animals around the world, it's a little bit different everywhere. Different ecosystems, different life forms. It took thousands of years of trade and travel to be able to go to Walmart and see all these different fruits and vegetables and meats and stuff from all over the planet. Guys, it was during this time period, because they helped to facilitate trade, that you start to see these basic things like cotton, sugar, citrus fruits, and rice funneled through Dar al-Islam and into places like Africa and Europe for the first time because they had never really been in those areas before. It's kind of weird, but just imagine how different the world would have looked that long ago. Now, if I move fast and you don't get all the notes, it's no big deal. Like I said, this PowerPoint is on Canvas. But what we're going to do now, and you don't have to write notes, I just think that it kind of helps to see some of the stuff in addition to hear about it and read about it. We're going to watch a very short video, it's like 4 minutes, over the golden age of Islam. The rise, and unfortunately. And then we don't have too much left. So please stay awake, keep your eyes on the screen, keep your heads off the desk, please stay off the phone, and enjoy the rise and fall of the golden age.
Muslim countries frequently make headlines for their attacks on freedom of expression, sexuality, education, or anything considered pro.
Gordon, the videos we're going to watch are on Canvas. There's 2 of them.
Embraced these institutions in a period of history scholars refer to as the Golden Age, which notably coincided with the European Dark Ages. So what exactly was the Golden Age of Islam? Well, most historians understand the Islamic Golden Age as a period of history under the Abbasid dynasty, which ruled from the 8th to 13th century. At the time, Islam was only about a century old and concentrated in the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. Once the Abbasids took over and formed the Caliphate, the capital was moved to Baghdad, and Islam spread to other regions. The Abbasids were inspired by verses from the Quran and Hadith that emphasized the value of knowledge rather than just religious devotion, and they strongly pushed for advances in science, art, and commerce. One of the most unique features of the Islamic Golden Age was its inclusivity. In Baghdad, the ruling caliph created a house of wisdom. Here, Christian and Jewish scholars were invited to join their Muslim counterparts to share ideas, information, and creative work, which was all translated into Arabic. These scholars carried out a variety of state-funded research projects, resulting in the Islamic world's first astronomical observatory and one of the most detailed world maps of the time. The House of Wisdom also fostered a considerable amount of scientific, philosophical, and scholarly works. Many Golden Age scholars put their studies to practical use, particularly in the field of medicine and healthcare. Physicians and philosophers wrote medical encyclopedias and textbooks that were used for centuries. One famous Persian physician was the first to differentiate between smallpox and measles. By the 10th century, pharmacies were a staple in most Muslim cities, and hospitals stayed open 24 hours. This era even saw a sort of universal health care, as hospitals were forbidden to turn away the poor. The period also gave way to some of the world's first universities, as well as countless works of art, including architecture, literature, and poetry. The Golden Age also saw the foundation of Sufism, which is a mystical Islamic philosophy that promotes peace, education, and philanthropy. Millions of people still adhere to Sufism, and the practice has been promoted as an alternative to radical forms of Islam. Most historians mark the 13th century as the end of the Golden Age, when Genghis Khan and his Mongol army conquered much of East Asia, including the Islamic Caliphate. In 1258, the Mongols destroyed Baghdad and the House of Wisdom, anecdotally throwing so many books into the Tigris River that it ran black with ink. The Caliphate was completely demolished. Had history played out differently, there's no telling what Islam would look like today. India is one country hoping.
Getting into the 1200s, all these groups that we talk about, not all of them, but a lot of them, it's going to end with, then the Mongols showed up and killed everybody. The Mongols we will get into, not for probably another, I don't know, week and a half or something like that, maybe 2 weeks. But yeah, they were a pretty devastating force throughout Asia during this time period. Although they do actually do a few halfway decent things, a lot of really, really bad things. Okay, so this is a lot. Don't feel like you got to write it all word for word. I would say at the very least, though, get these people's names down and just a little bit about what they did. Because they're the specific individuals referenced in our curriculum guide that just kind of are supposed to illustrate just the advancements that are being made during this golden age of Islam, during the Abbasid Caliphate, and even a little bit afterwards. So let me preface this by saying I will mispronounce some of these names. I'm going to do the best I can. You guys read all the Arabic names yesterday. Some of them, especially for us Westerners, are hard to pronounce. So We'll see. I'll probably come pretty close. So in the era or area of science, we have Nasr al-Din al-Tusi, 1201 to 1274, which is a pretty good run for those days. One of the most celebrated Islamic scholars ever. Contributed to astronomy, law, logic, ethics, trigonometry, philosophy, and medicine. Built an advanced astronomical observatory that was the most advanced in the world at the time. I think that's the one that they referenced in the video. In the area of history, Ad-Din Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, also a pretty good run during this time period. Generally acknowledged as the founder of historiography, the study of the methods of historians, and the founder of sociology, which is an elective course you can take here at Chisholm Trail. The study of the development and functioning and structure of human societies, which again, a whole subject, you know, that is still taught in public schools and universities. Well, it's founded by this individual. In the area of literature, and this kind of gets into what we're going to talk about next, Aisha al-Baunia, 1460 to 1507. She was a Sufi poet, we'll explain what a Sufi is, and mystic, who is arguably the most prolific female Muslim writer prior to the 20th century. Her poetry reflects the contrast between most Muslims and Sufis. So it's kind of a two-part deal. First, let's think back to patriarchy in Islam. We went over Sharia law the other day, you know, the laws of Islam. Again, you know, Islam and politics are very much intertwined in a lot of different places. And that goes all the way back to the time period of Muhammad. There is that emphasis in Islam of dressing modestly, especially for women, not showing too much skin, nothing revealing, you know. And, you know, in some ways that is a reflection of the religion, but in other many ways, this is a reflection of the culture that Islam's practicing. You know, remember, religions as they travel, especially the ones that proselytize and want to get new members, they adapt a lot of local customs. So yeah, the whole modest dress is a part of the faith, but exactly how that's applied, that's more cultural. That's why, you know, you're going to see in Afghanistan a woman probably in a full hijab, whereas a little further to the west, maybe it's a simple head covering. It just kind of varies. But with that, and plus how you see women treated in some Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, you know, one of the knocks on Islam is it is maybe more patriarchal than most belief systems. And I think to some extent that's fair to say. But you got to understand, for the time period that it came out of, it was much more liberal than, say, Christianity or Buddhism and Hinduism. And she's a good example. She's this famous writer. She's one of the most famous female writers in history. And she's a woman. You know, the fact that her ideas and her artistic style would be so valued in you know, a time period roughly 500 years ago, is worth noting. Now, Aisha here was a Sufi, which, guys, Sufis are Muslims, but it's kind of that third, small, mysterious branch of Islam you don't hear much about. Now, I'm going to read this to you. We're going to watch a short video over it. It's a little confusing. Okay, so just remember kind of the basics. And if you got that down, you'll be fine if you ever come across Sufi or Sufism. Unlike most Muslims who focus on intellectual pursuits, such as the study of the Quran, Sufis emphasize introspection, looking inside yourself, and mysticism, it's very mysterious, to grasp truths that they believed could not be understood through learning. Sufism, likely a response to the love of luxury under the Umayyad Caliphate, played an important role in the spread of Islam. Sufi missionaries adapted to local cultures and traditions, sometimes interweaving local religious elements into Islam, and in this way won many converts. Sufism is much less structured than typical Islam. You know, it's not so much based on the sole study of the Quran, it's about finding an interpersonal relationship with Allah. And because it is much more free spirit and much more adaptable and much more, or I should say, less formal, you know, Sufis that traveled, they were able to gain additional adherence to the faith. So when you think Sufism, think it's the mystical, mysterious branch of Islam that did help to grow the faith at least a little. So I'm going to show you this video, knowing full well it doesn't really fully, it's not going to explain everything, but I think it will at least give you a different sense of what Sufism is all about. You do need to remember at least these basic characteristics, because if Sufism gets mentioned, you need to be able to associate with Islam, but it's that other kind of mysterious branch that most people don't really understand, including me. So this will probably be our last video of the day. I've got one more, but I doubt that we'll even bother with it. Let's do a little introduction to Sufism.
Ready?
But first, you're going to try to sell you correct. No, wait, last
The
period is
company
correct.
insulting you, Dove Glowing Shower
Yes.
Collection.
A lot of Sufis
Infused with
are
mango
into
and almond butter.
moisturizing.
Revealed radiance, glowing skin.
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. And the word Sufi comes from the word Suf, which is Arabic for wolf. They were mystics, they were ascetics, they were travelers. And what Sufism seeks to do is develop a personal relationship between the believer and the divine. Like most mystics, Sufism is not interested in an intercessor or an organized entity to mediate that relationship. And for many Sufis, that relationship takes the form of chanting, of singing, of dancing, and of other forms of artistic expression. Whereas more mainstream religious people will read sacred texts to find the word of God, mystics generally focus on what is beyond the word, on what is beyond duality, on the oneness of the experience. And that is often something that cannot be articulated through words. So art and poetry and music become powerful avenues to understanding God consciousness. And Sufis have pioneered this within the Muslim tradition for centuries. You can see a group like the Whirling Dervishes, who are followers of Rumi and who have a very sophisticated way of whirling as a form of devotion or practice to God. Rumi is a Persian Sufi poet. He happens to be the best-selling poet in the United States, but he really comes out of a medieval literary tradition. And his work really illustrates how Sufis can have a direct relationship with God through literary, artistic, and musical avenues. And so for Sufis, their path is a path that directly connects with God without an intercessor. It's beyond words. It's more of an experience. And in that regard, Sufis have more in common with the other mystical traditions of the world than they do even with their Muslim co-religionists.
I couldn't spin for that long without throwing up, but you know, maybe that's part of the experience. I don't know. Anyway, remember the basics. If you've got that down, you'll at least be able to associate it with Islam and kind of the mysticism, you know, the inner turmoil and the introspection of kind of developing a relationship with God. And if you got that, I think you'll be okay. Once we get into like the late 900s, the early 1000s, the Abbasids are really on the decline. And it's mainly because other different Muslim groups start to kind of chip away at their territory. They always had problems with the Byzantine, who were not Muslims, but they were their neighbors. The Byzantine, very Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian. The Abbasids, you know, Muslim. Having somebody like that on your border was always a strain. But then you had these new groups rise up from within and from without the empire that started taking over more and more territory. The big transition here in really kind of moving forward with the rest of the Muslim empires we'll talk about, whereas, you know, the early caliphates were largely Arabic, these are largely Turkey. Okay, they're the Turks, a group that originates in Central Asia, but over time migrates into the Middle East and elsewhere. There's a modern country named after the Turks. Anybody know what it is?
Turkey.
Turkey, very good, very good. So that's the big shift that's happening. Groups like the Fatimids and the Mamluks and the Seljuks, they start chipping away at their territory, and then the Mongols come and kind of put the death down. Okay, this is the last slide, really, of writing anything. And again, you don't have to write down everything. I would know some of the reasons for the decline, but definitely know these groups. These are the main groups that really kind of take the Abbasids out and eliminate. But they were already on the decline for many years. Starting in the 900s, you know, for a lot of the same reasons as other groups, you know, the Abbasids start to contract, they start to lose power, they start to lose territory. Geographic overextension, they got too big. Diversity makes political unity difficult. We're dealing with the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, lots of different ethnic groups, lots of different cultures. Even if they're united by the Islamic faith, there's a lot of cultural elements that make them very diverse. The Sunni Shiite split, always from this point on, is going to weaken that unity. I mean, when you've got one united belief system under a united government and a united code of religious law, Sharia, it's easy to unify people. But very early on, after the death of Muhammad, you have that split, and that tension just grows and grows over the years. It remains to this day. Economic competition through shifting trade routes, especially as Indian Ocean trade gets more dominant and as people find kind of other routes kind of breaking off of the Silk Road. You know, if you control the areas that trade routes funnel through naturally, you can make a lot of money off of it. But if people can kind of learn to circumvent you and cut you out, I mean, that's going to cost you financially. And then finally, invasion. Bunches of different groups of people come in over the years, and eventually it's just too much to contend with. The first we're going to talk about are the Seljuk Turks. There's a lot of groups of Turks, okay? Eventually, they'll even be replaced by the Ottoman Turks, which we'll talk a lot about the Ottomans. They're around up until World War I, so after World War I. That's why they're not around. But the Seljuks is the first big group of Turks that come in and kind of take over most of the Abbasid territory. Again, these are Islamic nomads from Central Asia. They had converted previously. They come into the Middle East during the 1000s, the 11th century. Their leaders, you know, become known as sultans. The word sultan is going to be popularized moving forward. And while they don't completely kill off the Abbasids, they basically relegate them to just being religious leaders, whereas the politics are handled more by the Seljuks. Now, in the years that the Abbasids were in control, you know, they controlled most of what is today Israel, which even at that point, getting into like the 900s, Israel was super important. To the Jewish people, this is the land that God promised them, their homeland. That's part of the Holy Covenant. To Christians, that's where Jesus was preaching and performing miracles and was crucified and was resurrected. To Muslims, this is where, you know, Muhammad ascended to heaven. So, you know, this is really important land. And even though the Abbasids were Muslims, they always kind of let Christians and Jews and others visit Israel and visit Jerusalem because, again, they saw this as almost something akin to tourism. They can make money off it. Pilgrims from Europe would travel there pretty regularly. And while they're there, they'd have to stay places and buy things, and that was good for the economy. The Seljuks said, no, you guys got to go. We're keeping you out. Well, this ticked off Europeans in a bad way. First, the Byzantine, or Eastern Orthodox Christians, and later, more to the west, where the Catholics, you know, were really mad they couldn't go to Jerusalem anymore. So in 1095, Pope Urban II, who, guys, the popes in Western Europe at this time, probably the most powerful people on the continent, he calls on European Christians to launch what he calls a crusade to retake the Holy Land from the Seljuk Turks, the Muslim Turks. And over the next 200 years, you're going to see numerous crusades to do just that. On one hand, the Christians never really fully regained control of the territory, not for the long term. And you do see an increase in animosity between Muslims and Christians for a long time moving forward out of that. But this interaction gets Western Europe's trading and traveling again, and really exposed to all those ideas while they were just kind of stagnating for years that the Middle East had kind of held on to. We'll talk more about the Crusades probably next week. You got the Mongols. Man, they took over, and whatever power was left of the Abbasids, mainly just Baghdad, they took over. They sacked the city in 1258. And Baghdad never really fully recovered. It was this thriving trade city, and after that, it's really not. Has anybody ever heard that term sack, like to sack a city? All right, this is terrible, but I want you to know it because you're going to hear it, especially when we get into the Mongols. When a group comes in and sacks a city, they essentially come in, they murder all the men, they rape all the women, they enslave the survivors, they steal everything that's not nailed down, they burn down the rest. It is utter hell on earth. It's about as bad a situation as you could find yourself in. So when we talk about, yeah, the Mongols sacked this city, you know, I want you to know the reality of it. It's bad. It's really bad. And unfortunately, throughout history, you're going to see this a lot, especially during this time period. The final group that kind of took over the remainder of what was left of the Mongol territory, the Egyptian Mamluks. Ethnically Turks, a lot of these new groups are Turks, they'll kind of take over the Muslim world. They were originally bought as slaves to serve as soldiers and eventually bureaucrats for the Abbasids. But then they rebelled. They seized control of Egypt, establishing the Mamluk Sultanates, which is just another type of Muslim empire, if you ever see Sultan or Sultanate, where they facilitated trade, again, cotton, sugar, a lot of that Islamic agricultural revolution. Again, the sacking of Baghdad, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but that was just mean, throwing all the books in the rivers. That's just, very mean-spirited. You'll find that the Mongols did a lot of stuff like that in their history. Last real slide of consequence, and we really don't have much time. Guys, it's really during this time period that Islam spreads far and wide. Yes, through warfare, but also trade and travel. Does anybody know what the most populated Muslim country is on earth? Yeah, it's not anywhere near the Middle East. I want to write down this one last thing. Indonesia. Especially as Indian Ocean sea trade really took off. A lot of Muslims were traders. They spread the faith here. Still the most populated Muslim country in the world. We call that a diasporic, I wrote it on the board, so it must be important, a diasporic community. You're going to see a lot of diasporic communities due to trade because, people from different regions with different beliefs, they disperse, which is what diasporic means. And, sometimes that brings their religion with them, as you can see here. And that is it. We are done for the day. Tomorrow we got 25 minutes. Still on the fence of exactly what we're going to do, but we are going to do some stuff, so please be here. It shouldn't be too difficult. And then next week, should be talking about the Americas, what's going on over there, maybe a little bit in Africa, and maybe by the end of the week, we'll be talking about Europe as well. And then we'll be done with the Global Tapestry Unit, Unit 1, and then we'll move on to Unit 2, how these different groups kind of exchanged with each other. Networks of exchange, that's going to be its own thing. That is when we talk about the Mongols as well, because, well, they take over a lot of the traders for a time. Other than that, if you will clear your desk, I'm going to come around and we'll spritz it. Make sure we keep it pretty. Remember, if you miss anything, I need that stuff by midnight. Before midnight, 11:59. All the information. You want to just leave it here? Yeah, you know it again since this morning. All right, you guys have a fantastic day. Ball, hang out 1 second. Yes, I got it. I'll update your grade before I leave today.
If we're not gonna be here, do you want tomorrow? Do you want me to get on the Teams meeting?
You can. It's going to be short. I'm probably going to make a little Flipgrid video that explains what you need to do. So it's just going to be a little bit of reading and vocab.
Okay.
So yeah, just get on there and make sure you log in and get your attendance done because of that.
Okay.
We'll see you. Have a good weekend, Espinosa.